Good day. Welcome to our Answers Weekly Wraps. I am Bob Govender. Before I start, I just want to basically remind you guys that this is Wolves Week. I know it's basically likely when you watch this, it'll be slightly after the end of Wolves Week. But we are offering a free will at the moment, even though it's like past the due date. Just go to the Ransource website and have a look there, and you'll find information about how to basically get a free will. If you can't find it there, just email, Ransource, support@ransource.com, and we will send you a questionnaire to help you basically create your own will for free. Wills are very important because, if you have any money, once you die, basically, there is going to be some issues about who gets that money. And if you don't have a will, you can basically not have your wishes basically be followed. And even if you do have, money going to the person you wanted to go to, there are many ways in which you can structure what happens to your estate after you pass. And by doing it in a smart way, you can often save a lot of money when it comes to things like, estate duties, executive fees, etc. So that's it again. A reminder to just basically get your will done and go to a website or just email support@ransource.com for help in getting a free will from Ransource. So let's start off with this week's little wrap up. We're going to discuss the interesting announcements from South Africa, as well as from the US. And the US, I want to pay special attention to what I think is something that's different about the US Fed, or what's going to be different about it going forward. People may be ignoring or not misunderstanding just how important it's going to be in the future. And then I want to look at Waymo and self-driving vehicles in the AI tech sector. The reason for this is that Waymo released some results in terms of its safety, statistics, and it has done millions of kilometers of driving at the moment. So it's a pretty large sample size, and we can make pretty strong estimates based on that going forward. So let's start off with the easy one, which is South Africa's interest rate announcement. Basically, the Reserve Bank did nothing. This is despite the fact that they don't expect us to go above the midpoint of the inflation number anytime soon, and despite the fact that growth in South Africa remains pretty weak. Now, I've always, and you guys know this, I've always supported whatever the Reserve Bank does in South Africa because it's done an exceptional job. When you consider the stability of the rand versus many other emerging currencies, even very large countries like Turkey, for instance, we have a remarkably stable, remarkably well-managed currency. And I think that is due to the caution of the Reserve Bank. The fact that the Reserve Bank is not cutting interest rates in this environment makes me believe that they are really moving towards that 3% target. Because think about it: if you had a target of say 4.5%, you're not going to get to 4.5%, and growth is basically still a bit anemic. What would you do? Cut interest rates a little bit because you can afford to go a little higher in terms of inflation. If ever you want to go down to 3%, then you just basically keep your hand on that the brake and just make sure that you maintain a lower inflation rate. And like I said before, there are many advantages to this, lower inflation rate. Get it down to 3%. Our interest rates are lower. Easier to basically have investments because cost of borrowing, etc., goes down. Many advantages. The cost of maintaining our own personal, or country sovereign debt is easier because, of course, it's cheaper to basically borrow money if our interest rates are lower. We have a huge, deficit, not as big as places like the US or parts of Europe or Japan, for instance. But definitely, a significant amount of government spending goes towards paying off our debt. So that is a positive. The negative side, of course, is that if we do basically set an inflation target that's too low, we'd be forced to have interest rates that are too high for the natural economy, and that would probably, hamper growth. Now, moving on to the US, which is far more interesting. The US had its rate announcement. As expected, it cut interest rates by 0.25%, 25 basis points. That wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part is that we had a dissent again. This is a Trump supporting person. That was the dissenter. And I want you to focus on what's going to be happening in the Fed over the next little while. Now, the US Fed, to those that don't know, is basically a semi-government, semi-non-government institution. It's non-government because, like most central banks, they want to have that independence. They want to have the fact that the money of the country is not controlled by the politicians of the country, because politicians always tend to do what Trump wants to do, which is basically have lower interest rates, more money printing, because in the short term, that feels good. And the short term basically boost that you get comes with a long-term cost, which is inflation, which is depreciating currency, which is instability in the long term. So generally, globally, what you want to do is you want to have an independent central bank because that maintains the value of the currency. So despite the fact that you might have short-term pain, like in South Africa, we have short-term pain, longer term, you can say that's probably been a positive that the rand has been more stable, and that overwhelms any kind of short-term pain we have by having a slightly higher interest rate. What Trump is doing right now is kind of like trying to reduce the independence of the central bank. Now, every president wants to do that. Every president wants to have low interest rates. Every president wants the central bank to kind of follow his kind of lead. This is not something new. Ronald Reagan had a talk with the back in the day with Paul Volcker, who was his central bank head back then, the Fed head. And this was, when Volcker raised interest rates dramatically in the US to cut inflation. And, kind of said, you better have this done by the time it comes to the election because I won't be able to survive an election with interest rates this high. So there has always been that kind of push by politicians to affect the way the central bank behaves. But what is different about this time around is that Trump is doing the similar kind of things that everyone else has done in the past, but all of them. What I mean by that? You can point to anything that Trump does and say there's something similar, maybe not as extreme as what Trump has done among previous presidents. We could talk about like what he's doing to Powell with what Reagan did to Volcker. We can talk about what he's done to Jimmy Kimmel, who's a left-wing news anchor, talk show host, late-night talk show host. And what, for instance, was done by basically Bill Maher back in the day with 9/11 when he made a joke about the hijackers on 9/11. And you can point to someone else did something similar. What Trump is doing, however, is doing a lot of the stuff at the same time, and he's doing it to a little higher degree than what others have done. So when it comes to, for instance, what he's done with Jimmy Kimmel, and I'm just going to focus on this as an example. Yes, Bill Maher was fired. Jimmy Kimmel is effectively fired. But Bill Maher wasn't fired because the head of the government agency that regulated the company that he worked for told them, you better fire this man. It was just kind of like an overall pressure in terms of public opinion, etc. It was after 9/11. You can imagine what it was like then to make a joke about the hijackers. This time around, we have again firing because of something Julius, a television person said. He made a joke about the killing of Charlie Kirk, which is a prominent right-wing personality, podcaster, etc. He was killed a little while ago, and of course Jimmy Kimmel made a joke about the killer. So you would expect, it's possible. It's the same thing. 9/11, of course, more people died, whatever. But someone died, you make a joke about it, you may lose your job. The difference this time around is that it's pushed by the government. So we had the official in charge of the agency regulating the company, right, which is Disney, saying, okay, you should fire this guy. That's so many words, and that is the difference. And why is this important for the Fed? Well, Trump is willing to do things that other people have not been as willing to do. We talked recently about a person called Lisa Cook, who's, by the way, is back on the Fed, but it's probably going to be appealed because the court reversed Trump's decision to fire her. But it's going to go up to the Supreme Court. For those that don't know, the Supreme Court is stacked somewhere between 6-3 Republican or 5-3 or 5-4 Republican. It's 9 people there. So it's either 5 or 6 person majority that the Republicans have. There's one person there that basically sometimes Republican, sometimes Democrat. Was a Republican, by the way. So it's going to go to the Supreme Court and might just pass in the Supreme Court. So he might just be able to fire after that extra couple steps were done. What Trump is doing here is he's basically trying to replace Fed governors, members of the Fed, ahead of time, ahead of schedule. So he's not just pressuring them like Reagan had a talk with Paul Volcker. Trump has definitely talked to Jerome Powell. But he's saying, I'm using other techniques as well. I'm using other methodologies, other ways of actually pressuring these people, including, trying to get them fired from the job or trying to move them from the job. Now, the argument behind what he's doing with Lisa Cook, could be something I could say. Basically, you can argue that what he's doing there is something that you can find examples of elsewhere. For instance, even the crime is accusing her of doing is something similar to what he was accused of, and that was what that court case in New York was about lying about borrowing money from a bank, or borrowing money from a bank rather. When you go to a bank and you're basically filling the forms and say, I want to borrow some money from you, and making a couple of lies there to lower your interest rate. That's kind of what he was accused of. So you can say, okay, this is the same kind of crime I was accused of. Pressuring the Fed. Same kind of thing Reagan did in the past. But putting all these things together, the overall effect is larger than what it was in the past. And what I want to basically propose to you is this. Over the next couple of years, or the next 3 years or so, Trump's going to have multiple opportunities to appoint new members to the Fed. Even if he doesn't get the chance to remove one person because, or a couple of people because of malfeasance or committing a crime or whatever you want to say, for cause, let me say. But just the natural role of things. Like Jerome Powell is gone next year. The Fed is going to be a lot more Trump friendly in the next couple of years than it is right now. And what does Trump want to do? Cut interest rates. Why? Because it jumps up the stock market, it jumps up the economy, it makes him look better in the short term. So in the next 2 or 3 years, expect the US Fed to be far less independent than it was in the past. A less independent Fed is going to result in a couple of things. Probably higher inflation, probably lower interest rates, and factor that into your calculations about what the US economy looks like, what the global economy looks like going forward. Expecting the dollar to be weaker, expecting gold to be higher, Bitcoin to be higher. Those kind of things you can kind of interpolate from this kind of moves that the administration is doing. Now, I'm not saying that this is something that nobody else has done in the past. But I'm just saying that the level and the degree that he's going to push things is higher. What we're learning in the Trump administration is this: that over time, what we thought to be kind of rules were actually just habits or kind of like courtesies. And if somebody's willing to just push against those courtesies, the actual rules bounding what the US president can do is probably a lot weaker than we thought. Okay. Now moving on to Waymo and self-driving vehicles. Waymo released some stats about its self-driving vehicles this week, and it indicated that they are significantly better at driving than the average human driver at the moment, at least in the areas they drive in. Understand that Waymo is what's called geofenced. That means there's certain areas that you can operate in. And in those areas, it's been found that Waymo is significantly safer than human drivers in those areas. How safe? How much safer? If all, so firstly, you got to say that in terms of actual accidents, there are lower accidents, but more importantly, the accidents that Waymo gets into are at far lower speeds than other accidents or human accidents. So if Waymo has an accident, it's probably happening at 1 or 2 k's per hour, versus a human being has an accident, sometimes it's 10, 20 k's per hour. Now, that difference in speed results in far greater amounts of damage done by the human accidents than by the Waymo accidents. So even though Waymo has fewer accidents, those accidents are also much less, deadly. If you take Waymo's results in terms of safety, and you say, okay, if the entire country of the entire US basically used Waymo, nobody drove and everybody used Waymo, what would be the difference? It turns out to be something like 30,000 deaths per year. 30,000 deaths per year could be saved in the US if Waymo was doing the driving as opposed to human drivers. That is a huge amount of people that are killed each year by human drivers. Now, when you get to the numbers, where it's clear that the robot is safer than the human, and it's probably going to get safer every year. I mean, this is not the peak Waymo. Waymo is going to get better every year. Tesla is going to get better every year. These cars are going to get better every year. If it's that much safer right now, in 10 years' time, it'll be even safer. When people argue with you and say, but they won't let the regulations won't let, drivers be replaced. It won't let humans basically, it won't. You have to wait until regulations allow for self-driving vehicles to be on the road, because the politicians are going to basically be cautious about it and slow down how quickly self-driving vehicles are allowed to basically be operating in the country. So South Africa the government might say, no, we don't want any self-driving vehicles. Everything must be done by a human because we're going to save jobs or something like that. How are we going to do that when you have tens of thousands of people in South Africa dying because of this particular thing. When you have, for instance, self-driving vehicles taking off in anywhere in the world, the US is already starting off with this, but I mean, let's just say expands, and we start to see more and more evidence that Waymo and other self-driving companies are much, much safer than humans. How are the politicians in South Africa going to justify not allowing these vehicles to basically be on the road when it's shown that they are much, much safer than other vehicles? Lawsuits are going to follow. People are going to go to court and say, if everyone's being, or if self-driving vehicles were allowed, my father or my child would not have been killed in this scenario. Expect a lot of pressure to come through on the self-driving side as it becomes clearer and clearer that safety is much, much better with the automated vehicles as opposed to the human-driven vehicles. And even when it comes to, for instance, the commercial stuff, and especially I think when it comes to the commercial stuff, imagine what happens when a truck kills a bunch of people driven by a human, and somebody says, hey, if it had been driven by a Waymo or equivalent kind of AI kind of system, this accident probably would not have occurred. Then you're going to be seeing a situation in which the lawsuits, the lawfare, etc., is going to be much, much more in favor of the automated vehicles as opposed to the human-driven vehicles. And forget about not allowing automated vehicles. I can foresee a future in the next decade or two where it might be the opposite, where it's going to be much, much more difficult to have or to justify a human-driven vehicle, especially a commercial vehicle, than it is to have a machine-driven vehicle, because the human-driven vehicle is going to be orders of magnitude, tens of times more dangerous than a computer or a machine-driven vehicle. Okay, and I think that is a very important factor to be considering as well. Don't expect to see, for instance, it's going to take decades and decades before self-driving cars are, normal in South Africa or available in South Africa, or available in Africa or available globally, etc., because of things like unionization and all these other things. Like I said, once it becomes clear that it's safer, and it's starting to become very clear, even the data we have right now from Waymo, like I said, tens of millions of kilometers of driven about Waymo. We know enough for tens of millions of kilometers driven what the stats are. I mean, a good indicator of safety is how many times does the airbag deploy? Because you may have a bump, but if the bump is above a certain level of force, the airbag doesn't deploy. And you look at the amount of airbag deployments in a Waymo vehicle versus a normal vehicle, or normal human-driven vehicle, on average, it is a tiny fraction. And every year, it's going to get lower and lower. And there's going to be more and more evidence that these vehicles are significantly safer. And like I said, that is going to translate into pressure from, victims of accidents, that kind of stuff, as to, what happens when we basically go to the Constitutional Court and say, okay, the government is basically killing 10,000 people a year because it wants to have jobs for trucker drivers or something like that. I don't think that stands up in the Constitutional Court in South Africa. I don't think it stands up in most courts globally. And I think that is something that we have to factor in, that we're probably going to see the adoption of these self-driving things a lot quicker than most people anticipate. What does it translate to? Well, it translates to things like copper being more in demand, because these vehicles use a lot more copper for the vehicle, for the grid, for the charging, etc., than a normal, petrol-driven vehicle. And why does it have to be electronic? Because electrical vehicles are much easier to operate by these machines than a petrol-driven vehicle or a fossil fuel-driven vehicle. So copper. It's going to change how people behave with regards to real estate. A number of different factors. Maybe one day I'll do a little breakdown of what my belief is around what we're changing when we have more self-driving. But it's going to have a huge impact on the economy. And I'm just saying to you that, yes, we've had petrol-driven vehicles or diesel or fossil fuel-driven vehicles for over a century now. And so lots of stuff in the infrastructure is basically built around that. But if it's clear, and it's going to be very clear, that self-driving vehicles are safer, that switch around will happen a lot quicker than you think, just because of the fact that lawfare, etc., will force it in that direction. Okay, that's for this week. Thanks for joining me. I look forward to speaking again next week. And don't forget, get your will done. Email support@ransford.com to ask for a form to basically sort your will out. Thanks for joining me. Cheers.